Crazy Love. Chapter 1. A Fateful Encounter. Emma never believed in fate. She was someone who preferred to see the world through the lens of logic and common sense. In her world, everything had an explanation, from chance meetings to unexpected twists of fate. But that evening, at an art exhibition downtown, her beliefs were shaken. Through the crowd of visitors eagerly discussing the exhibited works, Emma noticed him. Tall, with dark hair, he stood in front of one of the paintings, seemingly hypnotized by it. His gaze was focused, but there was something more in it, something that made Emma stop and forget that she had come here in search of inspiration for a new advertising campaign. She couldn't take her eyes off this man. There was something magnetic about him, as if he were the center of the universe, and everything around him revolved solely around him. Emma approached him, feeling her heart begin to beat faster and her palms grow sweaty with excitement. "Beautiful work, isn't it?" she said softly, trying to overcome her own embarrassment. Her voice trembled slightly, but she hoped he wouldn't notice. The man slowly turned to her. His eyes were dark and deep, like a bottomless lake in which it was easy to drown. He looked at her with interest, but without excessive emotion. "Yes, indeed," he replied with a slight smile that barely touched his lips. "The painting is stunning, but there's something unsettling about it, as if the artist was trying to convey his pain through the colors." Emma hadn't expected such a response. She was sure she would meet an ordinary person who admired art on a superficial level. But this man seemed to see more than most. "I'm Emma," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "John," he replied, firmly shaking her hand. Their hands lingered a moment longer than required by a simple handshake. As if both sensed that this encounter was no accident, Emma caught something inexplicable but intriguing in his gaze, and suddenly felt a strange sensation wash over her. Something about this man unsettled her, but at the same time drew her in, like a moth to a flame. They continued to talk, gradually diving into discussions about art, life, and how coincidences could change the course of events. Each of his responses was sharp as a blade, and Emma was surprised to find herself increasingly drawn into the conversation. Time flew by unnoticed, and when they finally decided to leave the gallery, Emma realized that her life had already begun to change. Outside, it was a warm summer evening. A light breeze played with her hair, and the city was filled with the sounds of evening bustle. John offered to walk her to a taxi, and she agreed without hesitation. There was something mesmerizing about his presence, and Emma wanted to hold on to the moment as long as possible. When their eyes met as the taxi arrived, Emma felt a tightness in her chest. Something in his words and voice promised much, and at the same time hid danger. Emma hesitated for a moment, but meeting his farewell gaze, she knew she had already gone too far to turn back. So began her story, a story that would turn her life upside down, make her rethink everything she thought was right, and lead her to the edge of madness. Emma could not have imagined that this encounter would be the beginning of her journey into a world where love and madness walk hand in hand, where reality mixes with illusions, and where fate plays by its own rules. Chapter 2. Attraction. A week had passed since that encounter, but the image of John hadn't left Emma's mind. She found herself constantly thinking about his voice, his gaze, about how his words seemed to pierce her soul. The time spent together at the exhibition seemed forever imprinted in her memory, like an important scene from a movie that you can't skip. Her friend Sarah, noticing Emma's distraction, decided to spend lunch break alone with her. They chose a cozy cafe near the office, where they often met to discuss news and work. But this time, Emma couldn't focus on the usual conversations. "Emma, what's going on? You don't seem yourself today," Sarah observed, pushing her cappuccino aside and looking at her friend with slight concern. Emma took a sip of her coffee, and without looking at Sarah, finally decided to talk about what had been troubling her all this time. "I met a man, John," she began, trying to keep her voice as calm as possible. "We met at the exhibition, and I can't stop thinking about him." Sarah squinted and looked at Emma closely. "You never told me about this. What's wrong with him?" she asked, seeing a shadow of doubt pass over her friend's face. Emma sighed, as if trying to free herself from the heavy burden on her heart. There's something strange about him, but at the same time incredibly attractive, she admitted. I can't explain what exactly, but this feeling won't leave me. It's like an obsession. Sarah frowned, tilting her head to the side, pondering Emma's words. Obsession? Emma, you need to be careful, she warned, gently squeezing her friend's hand. Sometimes we can get carried away with people who are not at all what they seem, especially if we're attracted to something we don't understand. Emma nodded, but inside her, two opposing feelings battled: caution and an irresistible desire to learn more about John. He was like a mystery she wanted to unravel, despite all the warnings. That evening, after returning home from work, Emma found a message on her phone. It was from John. Hi, Emma. I hope your week has been good. I can't stop thinking about our conversation at the gallery. Maybe we could continue it over dinner? John. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she read the message. She realized she had been waiting for this moment, even if she was afraid to admit it. Her fingers hovered over the phone's keyboard before she replied. Hi, John. I've been thinking a lot about our meeting, too. Let's meet. When are you free? The response didn't take long to come. Tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock. I know a great place. Does that work? Emma smiled. Excitement and anticipation filled her as soon as she agreed to the meeting. The next evening, Emma carefully chose her outfit, checking every detail. Her anxiety mixed with impatience, and every step brought her closer to a new meeting with John. The restaurant he chose was secluded and cozy, hidden from the noise of the big city. When Emma walked in, John was already waiting for her at a table by the window. The dim light, candles, and soft music created an atmosphere where it was easy to forget about time and place. He stood up as she approached, greeting her with a light touch of her hand. It was a gentle touch, but it pierced her through, like an electric shock. Emma, I'm glad to see you, John said, his voice as deep and soft as she remembered it. So am I, John, she replied, feeling her voice tremble slightly with excitement. They sat down at the table, and the conversation started naturally. John was surprisingly skillful in leading the conversation. He knew how to maintain interest and make his interlocutor open up. Time flew by unnoticed, and soon Emma felt as if she had known him all her life. However, in every word he spoke, in every movement, there was something elusive, something that made her feel on edge. It was as if he was opening up only partly, hiding something important. When dinner came to an end and they stepped outside, John offered to walk her home. Though Emma felt a strange unease, she agreed. They walked through the empty night streets, and their conversation gradually subsided. John was silent, his gaze directed forward, and Emma realized that he was immersed in his thoughts. A sense of anxiety gripped her, but at the same time there was a strange satisfaction in being close to him. When they reached her home, John stopped and looked at her. His gaze was intense, penetrating deep into her soul. Emma, he began, as if about to say something important, but then fell silent as if he changed his mind. She wanted to ask what was bothering him, but instead she just nodded, letting him know she was ready to listen. I'm glad we met again, he finally said with a slight smile. But there was something dark in that smile, something that made her heart skip a beat. He leaned in, their faces close, and she felt his breath on her skin. Her mind told her to step back, but her body wouldn't listen. His lips brushed against hers, and the world around them disappeared, leaving only the two of them in that moment. When the kiss ended, John took a step back and looked at her with his deep eyes. Good night, Emma, he said, his voice as soft as before. Emma silently watched as he walked away, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. This meeting left her confused, but at the same time she knew there was no turning back. Something dark and inexplicable was pulling her deeper, and with every step John took away, she felt that force growing stronger. She stood by the entrance to her home for a long time, trying to make sense of her feelings. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she was already deeply entangled in this. A passion was igniting in her soul, one that could not be contained, and she knew this was only the beginning of her journey on the razor's edge. Chapter 3. Blurred Lines. Several weeks had passed since Emma and John started seeing each other. Their relationship developed rapidly, like a hurricane that suddenly swept in and took her by storm. Each new day with him was like a new twist of that hurricane, drawing her deeper into its whirlpool. Emma felt she was losing control, but she couldn't stop. John had become the center of her universe. She woke up thinking of him, spent all day waiting for his call or message, and in the evenings they would spend time together, diving into conversations that became more and more open and deep. Emma shared with him her most intimate thoughts, feelings, and fears, feeling him increasingly penetrate her consciousness. However, despite their closeness, John remained a mystery. At times he was incredibly attentive, showing care and tenderness, but sometimes he would close himself off, retreating into dark thoughts he didn't want to talk about. These moments scared Emma, but she continued to convince herself it was just temporary, that he would eventually open up to her completely. One evening, as they sat on the couch at her place, John suddenly suggested they spend the weekend at his country house. The proposal caught Emma off guard, but excitement quickly replaced her surprise at the thought of spending secluded time away from the city. "I'd like to show you my place of retreat," he said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's quiet, peaceful, and we'll have the opportunity to be alone without distractions." Emma, captivated by his charm and ignoring the inner voice warning her of possible consequences, agreed. She knew this could be a chance to learn more about John, to peek into that part of his life he had so far kept hidden. The road to John's house was long and winding. They drove along narrow country roads surrounded by dense forests, where the sun barely pierced through the trees. Car was silent, but it was a silence that didn't cause discomfort. It was a silence of anticipation, filled with hidden tension. When they finally arrived at the destination, Emma saw before her an old mansion, nestled in greenery. The house looked as if it had been part of the landscape for centuries, holding the secrets of its previous owners within its walls. John stopped the car, got out, and opened the door for Emma, inviting her inside. The interior of the house was exactly as she had imagined it. Spacious rooms adorned with antique furniture and artworks, walls lined with paintings and photographs reflecting the history of the place. The air was filled with the scent of wood and old books, creating an atmosphere of both comfort and slight unease. "Welcome to my sanctuary," John said with a touch of irony in his voice, leading her through the house. "This is where I spend time when I need to think or just escape the city." Emma felt his words resonate within her with a strange echo. She increasingly sensed she was on the verge of something important, but at the same time dangerous. John was closer than ever, but in his gaze she still read a certain detachment, as if he wasn't fully with her. They spent the day walking around the property, discussing various topics, enjoying nature and each other's company. John showed Emma the old garden behind the house and told her how he often secluded himself there to reflect on life. Emma listened to him with interest, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was avoiding talking about something significant. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, John suddenly suggested they go up to the attic, where, according to him, his family's belongings were stored. That might interest her. Emma agreed with curiosity. Climbing the narrow spiral staircase, they found themselves in a dark and dusty room, full of old chests and boxes. John approached one of the chests and opened it, bringing out old photographs and letters into the light. He began to tell Emma about his family, about how the house had been passed down to him, and how he had spent his childhood within its walls. But there was a certain tension in his story, as if he was avoiding something important. Emma listened to him carefully, trying to understand what was troubling her so much. But her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise outside. John froze, then quickly moved to the window. His face turned pale and his eyes gleamed coldly. "We need to go back downstairs," he said curtly, closing the chest and heading for the stairs. Emma followed him, feeling her anxiety grow. When they returned to the living room, John suddenly closed off. He stopped talking, simply poured himself a glass of wine, and stared into the fire. Emma couldn't understand what had happened, but she felt John was far away from her now, lost in his thoughts somewhere in the darkness she couldn't see. Terrifying thought crossed her mind, that this man, whom she had begun to consider part of her life, was hiding something terrible. But instead of retreating, she decided to wait for him to open up to her. The night was long and restless. Emma lay in bed, listening to every sound coming from the old house. Her thoughts revolved around John, his strange behavior, and what might be lurking behind his outward facade. She felt she was standing on the edge of a revelation, but that revelation might forever change her life. When the first rays of morning sunlight broke through the curtains, Emma realized she had to decide whether she was ready to go all the way in this relationship, despite all the warning signs. She was drawn to John, but at the same time she felt something dark and unknown creeping toward her, like a shadow ready to consume her if she made the wrong move. Chapter 4. Obsession. The morning brought with it coolness and a light mist that enveloped the surroundings of John's country house. Emma, waking up with the first rays of the sun, felt the anxiety that had only grown stronger overnight. John was still a mystery, and their previous evening in the attic had left her with a sense of unfinished business. When Emma went down to the kitchen, she found John preparing breakfast. His face was calm again, and nothing reminded her of his agitation from the night before. He greeted her with a friendly smile, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Good morning," he said, handing her a cup of freshly brewed coffee. "How did you sleep?" Emma responded with a polite smile, but inside the anxiety was growing. She decided not to bring up the topic of the previous evening, even though questions were swirling in her mind. It seemed to her that John was deliberately diverting her attention from what really troubled him. Breakfast passed in a calm conversation about plans for the day, and soon they set out for a walk around the property. John showed her his favorite places, told stories about how he spent his childhood here, but Emma felt he was still hiding something. This feeling wouldn't leave her, and she couldn't concentrate on John's stories. After lunch, they returned to the house, and John suggested spending the rest of the day in the library, where rare books collected by his family over many years were stored. Emma agreed, but her thoughts were far from reading. She was overwhelmed by an irresistible desire to learn the truth, to penetrate the most hidden corners of John's soul, even if it meant facing something dangerous. They settled into cozy chairs by the fireplace, and John began reading aloud from one of the books. His voice was steady and calm, but Emma was barely listening, consumed by her thoughts. Her gaze kept returning to John, and in her mind the realization grew that she was becoming obsessed with this man. A desire to know more, to know everything he was hiding, even if it cost her peace of mind, grew stronger with each passing day, each minute spent with him. Her mind fought against it, but her heart had already made the decision. She wouldn't be able to stop until she knew everything. The next day, when they were returning to the city, Emma felt her obsession becoming more and more powerful. John was driving, and Emma was secretly watching him, trying to catch any signs of anxiety or unease. But his face remained impassive, and that only intensified her curiosity and desire to understand what was happening inside him. When they returned to her apartment, John lingered at the door for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but then, unexpectedly for her, suggested she stay with him for a few days. Emma agreed without hesitation. Her desire to be close to him was becoming irresistible. Their life together began to resemble playing with fire. John was attentive, but often withdrew into himself, became distant, and lost in his thoughts. Emma noticed that he had moments when he seemed like a stranger to her, as if his thoughts were taking him to some dark places he didn't want to talk about. One evening, when John was late at work, Emma, left alone in his apartment, decided to explore his home a little. She wandered through the rooms, examining books, photographs, and works of art that seemed to reflect the owner's character. But her attention was drawn to locked drawers in his study. Unable to resist, she decided to try to open one of them. Inside, she found an old leather-bound diary, worn and battered. At first she hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. First pages were filled with memories and thoughts that, judging by the handwriting, belonged to John. He wrote about his life, his anxieties and fears, about what troubled and tormented him. But as Emma delved deeper into the diary, she began to notice that it became darker and more chaotic. In the last entries, there was anxiety, panic, and fear that seemed to be taking over John. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. She felt a chill run down her spine, and her heart tightened from what she read. The entries became more disjointed, incoherent, as if John was losing control of himself. In one of the entries, he wrote about feeling something dark rising inside him and how he feared losing control. In another entry, he mentioned Emma, saying she was the only thing keeping him on the edge of sanity. Emma froze when she read this. She couldn't believe her eyes. All her suspicions were confirmed, and now she realized that her obsession with John was no mere coincidence. They were both caught up in something greater, something that could destroy their lives. At that moment, the door to the apartment opened, and John appeared in the doorway. He saw her with the diary in her hands, and his face instantly changed. His gaze became cold and hard as ice. "What are you doing?" His voice was quiet but laced with threat. Emma was at a loss for words, not knowing what to say. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. I just, she began, but didn't have time to finish. John walked up to her, snatched the diary from her hands, and slammed it shut with such force that she flinched. "You weren't supposed to do that." His voice was steady, but there was a dangerous note in it. Emma felt fear grip her. She realized she had crossed a line, and now their relationship would never be the same. John said nothing more. He simply put the diary back in the drawer, locked it, and left the room, leaving Emma alone. In his eyes was that same cold gleam she had seen in the attic, and now she knew that this man harbored a darkness that could consume them both. She remained alone in the dark room, feeling her heart tighten with pain and fear. She realized that her obsession with John had become her curse, and now she would have to face what she had brought into her life. Chapter 5. Revelation. A few days had passed since Emma discovered John's diary, but the tension between them hadn't disappeared. John became even more withdrawn, his behavior unpredictable and distant. Emma felt she was losing him, and it terrified her. She tried to find a way to talk to John, but every time she brought up the subject, he skillfully steered the conversation away. His answers became increasingly brief, and his gazes increasingly vacant. Emma felt John drifting away from her, and it was driving her mad. The obsession she felt for him was becoming painful. Every move he made, every word or lack thereof, began to torment her. Sarah, noticing the changes in Emma, insisted on meeting. They met at the same cafe where they had discussed Emma's relationship with John before. Emma was so lost in her thoughts that she barely noticed her surroundings. "Emma, you look awful," Sarah observed with concern. "What's going on? You can trust me." Emma sighed, her gaze full of worry. "Sarah, I don't know what to do. Everything is going wrong," she began, avoiding her friend's gaze. "John, he's hiding something from me and I can't ignore it. I found his diary, and it says he's afraid of losing control over himself." Sarah tensed, hearing this. She had long suspected that something was off with John, and now her suspicions were confirmed. "Emma, you need to be careful. If he's writing about his fears, it could be dangerous. You need to think about yourself," Sarah said, squeezing her friend's hand. "Maybe you should distance yourself from him for a while, to think everything through." Emma knew Sarah was right, but something inside her resisted. Her feelings for John were too strong for her to simply leave. "I can't just leave," she whispered, struggling to hold back tears. "I need to understand what's happening to him. I feel like there's something more behind this." Sarah sighed heavily, realizing Emma wasn't ready to listen to reason. Her friend was trapped by her own emotions, making the situation even more dangerous. "Then at least be careful," Sarah conceded. "And if something goes wrong, don't try to handle it alone. Promise me you'll reach out for help." Emma nodded, but inside there were too many contradictions. She knew Sarah was speaking sense, but her obsession with John wouldn't let her simply walk away. That evening, when she returned home, Emma felt even more overwhelmed. She took a hot bath, trying to relax and clear her mind, but the anxiety wouldn't leave her. John's glances, his strange behavior, the diary, it all came together in a mosaic that seemed to be part of something bigger, but Emma couldn't fully grasp what it was. When she stepped out of the bath and approached the window to get some fresh air, her phone rang. It was John. "Emma, I would like you to come over tonight," he said, his voice sounding unusually cold and distant. "We need to talk." These words sent an icy lump to her stomach, but she agreed. John was too important to her, and she couldn't refuse, even if she felt it might be dangerous. When she arrived at his place, night had already covered the city in darkness. John met her at the door and, without saying a word, led her into the living room. His face was serious and tense. For a while they sat in silence, tension hanging between them. Emma noticed his hands were trembling slightly, which only heightened her anxiety. "Emma, I have to tell you something," John finally said, his voice full of tension. "What you found my diary was no accident. I wanted you to know the truth, but I was afraid of how you would react." Emma didn't know what to say. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like she wouldn't be able to bear it. "What do you mean? What truth?" she whispered, clutching her hands on her lap. John looked away, as if he couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm not who you think I am. There's been a lot of darkness in my life, and I've always fought it, but sometimes it takes over. It's like a curse that I can't get rid of." His voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. "I'm afraid it will take control again, and I won't be able to stop myself. That's why I've tried to stay away from people. But with you, everything changed." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She realized her fears had been confirmed, but it was too late to turn back. "What do you mean? What is this darkness?" Her voice was filled with fear and despair. John finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw such pain that she involuntarily recoiled. "I can't tell you everything, but know this. If you stay close, you might get hurt. I don't want that, but I can't promise I can protect you from myself." Emma stared at him, her mind struggling with her emotions. She knew she should leave, that this man could be dangerous, but her love and obsession wouldn't let her simply walk away. "I'm not afraid of you, John," she whispered, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "I want to help you, even if it means putting myself at risk." John closed his eyes, his face contorted in pain. He knew Emma was making a mistake, but her words made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope. Then be prepared for a difficult road ahead," he finally said, squeezing her hands. "I don't want to lose you, but you have to understand that we both might be in danger." Emma nodded, her heart overflowing with feelings. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, but her love for John was stronger than her fear. They sat in silence, holding hands, understanding that now their fates were intertwined more tightly than ever. This night marked the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship, where love and darkness intertwined, creating a bond that could destroy them both. Chapter 6. Doubt and Fear. Several days passed after that conversation. Emma and John continued to see each other, but now their relationship had taken on a new shade. It had become more tense, filled with anxiety and unpredictability. Emma felt something dangerous growing between them, threatening to tear them apart. John tried to be attentive and caring, but more and more often, Emma noticed him retreating into himself, distancing himself from her. He became even more withdrawn, sometimes disappearing for hours without explaining where he had been. Emma felt she was losing him, and it terrified her. One evening, as they were having dinner at his place, Emma noticed that John was once again lost in his thoughts. His gaze was distant, as if he were somewhere far away. Her heart tightened with worry, and she decided to ask what had been troubling her for so long. "John, you've changed. I can see something is bothering you, but you don't want to talk about it. What's going on?" Her voice trembled, but there was determination in it. John froze as if he hadn't expected the question. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a mixture of emotions: pain, fear, and something else she couldn't identify. "Emma, I didn't want you to get involved in all this," he began, his voice quiet and full of regret. "But I realize I can't keep hiding the truth. You deserve to know what we're dealing with." Emma froze, her heart quickening its pace. She was ready to hear whatever he had to say, even if it was the most terrifying confession. "I'm struggling with something I can't control," John continued, lowering his gaze. "It's darkness that lives inside me. I don't know where it came from, but it's always been there, lurking, waiting for the moment to come out." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. His words frightened her, but she couldn't walk away, not without knowing the whole truth. "Why now? What's changed?" she asked, feeling her voice break. John closed his eyes as if trying to gather his thoughts. "Everything changed when you came into my life," he finally said, his voice full of pain. "I started feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. You became the light in my darkness, and I'm afraid that's what attracted it. It doesn't want me to be happy. It wants to destroy everything I care about." Emma was silent, her mind trying to process what she had just heard, but her mind refused to accept it. "John, she began, but the words stuck in her throat. "Yes, Emma." John cut her off, his eyes filled with pain and despair. "I'm afraid this darkness will win. I'm afraid that one day I'll lose control and hurt you. That's why I tried to keep my distance, but you kept coming closer." Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her heart broke for John, but she couldn't leave him alone in this fight. "We'll find a way to deal with this, John," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We'll get through this together." John looked at her, his eyes softening but still shadowed. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I'm afraid it's getting stronger. I can't control it anymore. And I'm afraid that when the time comes, I won't be able to hold on." Emma felt her heart tighten with fear, but she couldn't back down. "You're not alone, John," she said firmly, despite the tremor in her voice. "I'm here. I'll be with you, no matter what." John sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he had finally accepted the inevitable. "Then be prepared for a rough road ahead," he said quietly, squeezing her hand. "I'll try to protect you, but if I lose control, you have to leave." Emma nodded, but inside her were too many emotions. She knew she had chosen a path full of dangers, but she couldn't do otherwise. Her love for John was stronger than fear. All night they sat in silence, sitting together and holding hands, as if that could keep them from falling apart. Emma couldn't sleep, her thoughts swinging between fear and determination. But one thing was clear. She couldn't leave John alone in this fight, even if it meant risking her own life. The next day, Emma decided to do something she had long postponed. She returned home and found John's diary, which she had brought with her after that evening. Opening it to the pages she hadn't read yet, she hoped to find answers to her questions. The entries grew darker and more chaotic. John wrote about his fear of the darkness taking over, about how he tried to hold it back, but sometimes it broke through. In one entry, he described how he was overcome with rage, how he had to fight the urge to harm those around him. Emma froze when she came across an entry made shortly before their first meeting. In it, John wrote about sensing something terrible approaching, that his life was about to change, and he wasn't sure if he could handle it. She realized that John was truly suffering, that his battle with himself was real, and this only strengthened her resolve to help him. But now she understood that it might be much more dangerous than she had thought. When she finished reading, there was a knock at her apartment door. Emma opened the door and saw Sarah, who looked worried. "I had to come by," Sarah said, looking at her friend closely. "Are you okay?" Emma nodded, but Sarah immediately noticed her tension. "Emma, did something happen?" Her voice was full of concern. Emma took a deep breath and decided to tell her everything she had learned about John. She knew she could trust Sarah, and she needed her support. When Emma finished her story, Sarah was shocked. Her face was serious, and she was silent for a long time before responding. "Emma, I understand that you love him, but you have to be careful. What he's describing might be really dangerous. We don't know what he's capable of if he loses control." Emma knew Sarah was right, but her love for John was too strong for her to simply walk away. "I can't leave him, Sarah. I have to help him," she replied, her voice firm. Sarah sighed heavily, but her eyes were full of understanding. "Then I'll be here to help you," she finally said. "But if something goes wrong, you have to promise me you won't keep it to yourself. We have to be ready for anything." Emma nodded, knowing it was the only sensible course of action. She knew that now their fates were entwined not only with John's, but also with the dark forces he harbored within. Night fell over the city, but Emma couldn't sleep. Her thoughts swung between fear and hope, and she realized that her life had changed forever. She had chosen a path that could lead to her destruction, but she couldn't turn away from it now. And as she closed her eyes, she knew what lay ahead, a struggle in which she would have to fight not only for her love, but also for her life. Chapter 7. The Limits of Reason. Emma woke with her heart pounding in her chest. The dream that had haunted her for the past few nights returned once more. In the dream, she stood on the edge of a bottomless chasm, where light and darkness intertwined, and every movement she made brought her closer to the brink. Far away, on the other side of the chasm, stood John, his face obscured in shadow, but she knew it was him. He reached out to her, but every time she tried to reach him, something unseen held her back, and she awoke, consumed with fear. The dream was becoming increasingly vivid, and Emma felt it was a reflection of her inner state, her growing anxiety and uncertainty. She knew that with each passing day, their relationship was becoming more strained, but her love and attachment to John wouldn't let her walk away. When Emma gathered her thoughts and drank a strong cup of coffee, her phone rang. It was John. "Emma, I'd like you to come to my place tonight," he said, his voice sounding unusually tense. "I need to tell you something important." These words made her heart skip a beat. Something in his voice was off. She felt that tonight, something would change, but she was ready to face it head on. "Okay, I'll come," she replied, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Evening found her at the door of John's apartment. She knocked, and the door opened immediately. John met her with a silent gaze, his face serious and tense. He gestured for her to come in, and Emma felt her anxiety rise. They walked into the living room, where the only light came from the fireplace. John sat down across from her, and for a while, a tense silence hung between them. Emma noticed his hands were shaking slightly, which only heightened her worry. "Emma, I have to show you something," John finally spoke, his voice full of tension. "It's something I've kept hidden for a long time, but now I realize you need to know." He stood up and left the room, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts. Her mind frantically searched for an explanation, but nothing rational came to mind. When John returned, he was holding a small wooden box. He carefully placed it on the table in front of Emma and opened the lid. Inside was a stack of photographs and a few old letters, worn with time. "This is my story," John began, his voice muted, as if he was struggling with himself to speak. "A story I've never told anyone." Emma picked up one of the photographs and froze. It showed a young John with a woman she didn't recognize. They stood together, smiling. But something about the photograph gave Emma a strange sense of unease. "That's my mother," John said, noticing her gaze. "And this was taken a year before she took her own life." These words struck Emma like a lightning bolt. She didn't know what to say and simply stared at John, trying to understand what had happened. "She was plagued by the same demons that haunt me," he continued, his voice trembling. "She fought it all her life, but in the end, she couldn't take it anymore. That darkness was passed on to me, and I'm afraid it's going to destroy me too." Emma couldn't believe her ears. She tried to process what she had just heard, but her mind refused to accept it. "John, you—" she began, but the words caught in her throat. "Yes, Emma," John cut her off sharply, his eyes filled with pain and despair. "I'm afraid that darkness is going to win. I'm afraid that one day I'll lose control and hurt you. That's why I've tried to keep my distance, but you kept coming closer." Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her heart broke for John, but she couldn't leave him alone in this fight. "We'll find a way to deal with this, John," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We'll get through this together." John looked at her, his eyes softening but still shadowed. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I'm afraid it's getting stronger. I can't control it anymore. And I'm afraid that when the time comes, I won't be able to hold on." Emma felt her heart tighten with fear, but she couldn't back down. "You're not alone, John," she said firmly, despite the tremor in her voice. "I'm here. I'll be with you, no matter what." John sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he had finally accepted the inevitable. "Then be prepared for a rough road ahead," he said quietly, squeezing her hand. "I'll try to protect you, but if I lose control, you have to leave." Emma nodded, but inside her were too many emotions. She knew she had chosen a path full of dangers, but she couldn't do otherwise. Her love for John was stronger than fear. They stood together in silence, looking out the window, where night was beginning to fall. They were facing a path full of challenges, and Emma knew that this path could lead them to the edge of the abyss. But she was ready to walk it to the end, no matter the dangers that lay ahead. Chapter 8. Escape. The following days were filled with tension and anxiety, which constantly haunted Emma. John was becoming more and more distant, and although she tried to support him, she felt their relationship was sinking deeper into darkness. The darkness he had spoken of seemed ever closer, and Emma began to fear that it would soon consume him entirely. One evening, as they sat in the living room, John suddenly stood up and said he needed to leave. His face was tense and his eyes were full of inner turmoil. Emma tried to ask where he was going, but he only briefly replied that he would be back soon. As soon as the door closed behind him, Emma felt a surge of anxiety. She couldn't just sit and wait for his return, not knowing what was happening. She decided to follow him, hoping she could help if something went wrong. Emma threw on her coat and hurried out of the apartment. She saw John walking briskly down the street, his figure disappearing into the night shadows. She followed him, trying to remain unnoticed. Inside her, fear and determination fought, but she knew she couldn't let him go alone. John moved confidently, as if he knew where he was going. They walked further and further, leaving the busy streets for quieter, more deserted areas. Emma tried not to lose sight of him, but each step heightened her anxiety. Finally, John turned into a narrow alley, and Emma realized they had reached an old, abandoned building. John stopped in front of a massive door, looked around, and then went inside. Emma froze, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She knew she had to follow him, but fear paralyzed her. What if John really lost control? What if the darkness he spoke of took over? But Emma couldn't back down. She took a deep breath and cautiously approached the door, trying to move silently. The door was ajar, and she stepped inside, finding herself in the dimly lit hall of the old building. The place was eerie and abandoned, its walls hidden in shadow, and the air was heavy and damp. She froze, listening. Footsteps echoed from deep within the building. Emma moved toward the sound, trying to make no noise. Inside her, the sense of danger grew, but she knew she had to keep going. Emma descended a narrow staircase leading to the basement. It was even darker there, and she could barely see where she was going. Her fear grew with each step, but she continued until she heard voices. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. John's voice was quiet and tense, as if he were talking to someone invisible. "I can't fight this anymore," he whispered, his voice full of despair. "It's stronger than me. I'm afraid I'll lose control and hurt her." Emma froze, feeling a chill run down her spine. She realized John was talking about her. Her heart tightened with pain and fear, but she knew she had to intervene. She took a step forward, but her foot caught on something on the floor, and she fell, making a loud noise. John turned instantly, and their eyes met. In his gaze, fear mixed with anger. "Emma, what are you doing here?" His voice was a whisper full of panic. "I couldn't leave you alone," she replied, trying to get to her feet. "I want to help you." John approached her, his face twisted with inner conflict. "You shouldn't have come," he said, gripping her arm so tightly she felt pain. "You don't understand what's happening. It's too dangerous." Emma looked into his eyes, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. "I can't leave you alone in this," she said, her voice trembling, but filled with determination. "We can get through this together." John closed his eyes, his face full of pain. "I'm afraid it's too late," he whispered, releasing her arms and stepping back. At that moment, a shadow appeared in his eyes that Emma had never seen before. That shadow grew stronger, and Emma realized she was losing him. Suddenly, John lunged at her, his face twisted with rage. Emma managed to dodge, but he grabbed her by the shoulders, his strength incredible. She felt his hands squeezing her so tightly she couldn't breathe. "Leave, Emma," he shouted, his voice full of despair and pain. "Before I do something I'll regret." But Emma couldn't leave. Her love for John was stronger than her fear. She struggled to hold on to him, but his strength was unbearable. "John, I won't leave," she shouted, her voice full of determination. "I won't leave you alone in this." At that moment, something changed in John. His hands loosened, and he froze, his face twisted with inner struggle. Emma felt his tension ease, and she took the opportunity to break free from his grip. They stood facing each other, their breaths heavy, their hearts pounding as one. John looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a mixture of pain, fear, and gratitude. "You don't understand what you're doing," he whispered, his voice full of exhaustion. "You're playing with fire, and I'm afraid we'll both get burned." Emma took a step towards him, her gaze full of love and determination. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice firm. "We can get through this together, John. I won't leave you." John sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he had given in to her determination. "Then we have to run," he said quietly, his voice full of exhaustion. "Right now. If we stay here, it will destroy us both." Emma nodded, her heart pounding with fear and excitement. She knew it was their only option. They had to run before it was too late. John grabbed her hand, and they ran towards the exit from the basement. Their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, and Emma felt fear grip her heart. But she knew she couldn't back down. They ran, trying not to look back, their hearts beating in unison as if they were bound by invisible threads. When they emerged onto the street, the night air felt liberating. John held her hand tightly, and together they ran into the night. Emma felt the wind whipping through her hair, and for a moment she felt a strange sense of freedom. But she knew that ahead lay uncertainty, full of dangers. They were running from the darkness that pursued them, but she knew they would have to face it eventually. And as they disappeared into the darkness, Emma realized their journey was just beginning. This journey would be full of trials, but she was ready to see it through to the end, despite the dangers that lay ahead. Chapter 9. Finale. Emma and John ran through the dark streets, trying to escape from the ghosts of the past and the darkness that seemed to pursue them at every step. Their breathing was heavy, but they didn't stop, desperate to get as far away as possible from the abandoned building from which the threat emanated. The night seemed endless, and time slowed. Emma felt anxiety growing inside her, mixed with a desperate determination to save John. She held his hand tightly, feeling him squeeze her palm. They were united in this escape. But inside, Emma grew the understanding that this run was not just an attempt to escape physical danger. It was a run from oneself, from the demons hidden in John's soul that were trying to take over him. Finally, they stopped at a small model on the outskirts of the city. John quickly paid for a room, and they disappeared inside, closing the door behind them as if that could protect them from the outside world. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling, but she tried to remain calm. John stood by the window, his face hidden in the shadows, and Emma couldn't read his emotions. The silence in the room became unbearable. "John," she whispered, breaking the silence. "We need to find a way to deal with this. I can't lose you." John slowly turned to her, his gaze heavy and full of pain. "Emma, I don't know if I can handle this," he replied, his voice filled with despair. "I'm afraid the darkness is already too strong. I don't want you to suffer because of me." Emma stood up and approached him, her hands gently resting on his shoulders. "I'm not afraid," she said firmly, her eyes sparkling with determination. "We can get through this together. I won't leave you." John squeezed her hands, his eyes full of gratitude, but also deep anxiety. "I don't know what to do, Emma," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I feel it growing inside me, and I'm afraid I won't be able to stop it." Emma took a deep breath, her mind frantically searching for a solution. "We need to find the root of this problem," she said, her voice filled with determination. "There has to be a way to stop this. We need to figure out what's causing this darkness in you and how to stop it." John lowered his head, his shoulders slumping. "I've been trying to do that my whole life," he said quietly. "But every time I thought I found a solution, it only got worse. I'm afraid it's too late now." Emma squeezed his hands tighter, her gaze full of compassion. "We'll find a way," she said firmly. "We'll get through this together, no matter what." At that moment, John lifted his head and looked at her. In his eyes, she saw a spark of hope, but also deep sadness. "I want to believe you, Emma," he whispered, "but I'm afraid I won't be able to win this fight." Emma pressed herself against him, her heart beating in unison with his. "You're not alone," she said. "I'm here, and I won't leave." John hugged her, their bodies merging into one, and for a moment they felt like one. But deep down, Emma knew they were facing a difficult path ahead. They spent the night in the motel, holding on to each other, as if that could keep them from falling into the abyss. When dawn broke through the curtains, Emma felt the time had come. They had to act. Emma remembered John's old house, where they had spent the weekend. She knew that there might be a clue there that could help them understand what was haunting John. She suggested they go back there and try to find answers. John hesitated at first, but then agreed. He understood that staying on the run no longer made sense. They had to face this head-on. The house greeted them with eerie silence. When they entered, Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Here, within these walls, seemed to hide the darkness that tormented John. They walked through the house, and John pointed to an old chest in the basement where his family's belongings were stored. Emma carefully opened it and began to go through the contents. Inside, she found old photographs, letters, and diaries belonging to John's mother. Emma began to read the diary, and soon it became clear that John's mother had also struggled with the same darkness. Her entries described fears and anxieties that strikingly resembled what John was experiencing. But one entry caught Emma's particular attention. In it, John's mother wrote about a ritual that was supposed to help banish the darkness. "This could be the answer," Emma said, showing the diary to John. "We can try to perform this ritual. Maybe it will help." John took the diary and began to read it. His face was thoughtful, but also filled with hope. "If this is our only chance," he said, "then we have to try." They prepared for the ritual, following the instructions from the diary. The ritual was complex and required deep concentration. They lit candles, arranged symbols, and John began to recite the words his mother had written in the diary. Emma stood by his side, holding his hand, and felt the tension rising. The room grew cold, and the air seemed to thicken around them. But she didn't let go of his hand, believing they could overcome this together. The ritual lasted for several hours, and with each moment, John seemed more focused and confident. At some point, the room became almost unbearably dark. But then, suddenly, everything went still. The darkness began to recede, and Emma felt the tension ease. When the ritual was over, John collapsed to his knees, his breathing heavy. But in his eyes, there was a light of hope. "Emma, I feel," he began, but didn't finish. At that moment, the darkness seemed to retreat. John slowly got to his feet, his face full of relief. "It worked," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "I feel the darkness has receded." Emma hugged him, their hearts beating as one. They had won, but this was only the first battle. The following days passed in peace they hadn't felt in a long time. John became increasingly confident, and Emma saw him regaining himself. But they knew there was still much work to be done. Their love, having endured all the trials, had only grown stronger. They were ready for new challenges, but now they knew they could overcome anything together. Emma and John stood on the threshold of a new chapter in their lives, where they could start fresh. Their journey had been full of dangers, but now they knew they could face anything together. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.